When a man begins to see what others do not, he often believes at first that he has been blessed. There is a subtle intoxication in this experience, a feeling that one has stepped behind the curtain of appearances and glimpsed the hidden machinery of the world. I have seen this many times in my patients, and I have known it in myself. One perceives motives where others insist on innocence, patterns where others swear there is only coincidence, shadows where others cling desperately to the comfort of light. And yet, I must tell you at the outset, this gift is never without danger. Indeed, it is often experienced first, not as a gift at all, but as a wound, a burden, or a quiet exile from the shared reality of one's fellows. You may already know what I am speaking of. Even if you have never named it, you walk into a room and feel the tension before a single word is spoken. You sense hostility wrapped in politeness, envy concealed beneath praise, fear masked by certainty. You hear what is not said. You notice the pause that lingers too long, the smile that does not reach the eyes, the sudden change of subject that betrays a complex. Others call you suspicious, negative, or overly sensitive. They advise you to relax, to stop overthinking, and yet your body tightens, your dreams grow vivid, your intuition refuses to be silenced. This is the beginning of the danger I wish to address, not because the perception itself is false, but because of the shadow. It constellates both in you and in those around you. To see what others do not is to step, whether you wish it or not, into the realm of the unconscious. Most human beings live by an unspoken agreement. We will not look too closely. We will accept the persona, the social mask, because it allows us to coexist without constant psychic conflict. The persona is not a lie in the simple sense. It is a compromise, a necessary fiction that makes communal life possible. But when you begin to see through this mask, when you perceive the discrepancy between what is shown and what is lived, you disrupt this agreement. You become, in a sense, a living question mark. And the psyche, as you know, does not tolerate questions easily, especially those that threaten its carefully constructed image of itself. Here, the shadow enters the scene. The shadow is not merely what is immoral or socially unacceptable. It is everything that the ego refuses to recognize as part of itself. It is composed of rejected impulses, unlived potentials, disowned fears, and above all, truths that are too painful or too destabilizing to integrate. When you see what others do not, you often become a carrier of their shadow, not because you wish to, but because you mirror it back to them without speaking a word. Your presence alone can provoke irritation, defensiveness, or sudden hostility. You may notice that people become strangely uneasy around you, that conversations turn brittle, that warmth is replaced by a subtle chill. They may accuse you of arrogance, judgment, or even malice, though you have said nothing at all. This is the shadow reaction nobody admits. The danger lies in what happens next. Within you, at first, you may feel confused. You wonder whether you are imagining things, whether you are projecting your own darkness onto others. This doubt is not only healthy, it is necessary. Without it, perception hardens into certainty, and certainty is the death of psychological growth. But if the doubt becomes chronic, if you begin to mistrust your own perceptions entirely, you risk severing yourself from your intuition, that delicate organ by which the unconscious speaks. Many sensitive individuals retreat at this stage, numbing themselves, dulling their awareness, choosing the comfort of blindness over the pain of isolation. Others take the opposite path. They cling to their vision with fanatic intensity, identifying with it, allowing it to inflate the ego. They become prophets, judges, or silent martyrs, convinced that they alone see the truth while the rest of humanity sleeps. Both paths are dangerous, for both represent a failure to integrate the shadow. Let me speak plainly. To see what others do not does not make you superior, nor does it make you cursed. It makes you responsible. Responsibility, however, is a burden the ego resists with all its might. It would prefer to be either innocent or omnipotent, but the psyche demands a third position, one that is far more difficult to sustain. You must hold your perception without weaponizing it, and you must endure misunderstanding without retreating into bitterness. This requires an inner work that few are willing to undertake, for it involves turning the same penetrating gaze inward. I recall a patient, a man of remarkable sensitivity, who came to me because he felt perpetually alienated. He spoke of his family, his colleagues, his friends, all with the same quiet despair. I see their contradictions, he said, their hidden motives, their self-deceptions, and when I try to speak of these things, even gently, I am met with anger or ridicule. As he spoke, I noticed a peculiar rigidity in his posture, a tension around the eyes that suggested not only perception, but vigilance. In his dreams, he was often a watchman on a tower, scanning the horizon for threats while the village slept below. The dream was unmistakable. He had identified with the function of seeing, and in doing so, he had lost contact with his own shadow. For what he did not see was his own hidden aggression, his unacknowledged resentment at being unrecognized, his subtle enjoyment of knowing more than others. These qualities were not evil in themselves, but because they were unconscious, they distorted his perception. He believed he was merely observing, but in truth he was also condemning. The psyche of those around him sensed this and responded accordingly. This is a law as old as human interaction. We are not attacked for what we know, but for what we embody unconsciously. You see, the shadow reaction is always mutual. When you see the shadow in others, your own shadow is simultaneously activated. If you deny this, you will suffer, and you will cause suffering. The danger is not the vision, but the one-sidedness of it. Depth psychology teaches us that every conscious attitude is compensated by an unconscious one. If your consciousness is aligned exclusively with insight, clarity, and exposure, your unconscious will accumulate secrecy, pride, and isolation. Eventually, this tension will erupt, either in symptoms, in relationships, or in dreams that disturb your peace. Perhaps you have had such dreams in which you are chased for knowing too much, silenced before you can speak, or standing alone while others turn away. or dreams in which you wield a light so bright that it blinds rather than illuminates. These are not warnings to stop seeing, they are invitations to deepen your seeing. The unconscious does not ask you to abandon your gift, but to humanize it. There is another danger I must name, one that is more subtle and more corrosive. When you repeatedly experience rejection or hostility for your perception, you may begin to internalize the shadow of the group. You may come to believe that something is fundamentally wrong with you, that your very awareness is a defect. This is particularly common in those who, from an early age, were attuned to the emotional undercurrents of their environment. As children, such individuals often became quiet observers, learning to read moods in order to survive. Their perception was adaptive, even life-saving, but what saves us in childhood can imprison us in adulthood if it remains unconscious. The psyche remembers. It remembers the price you paid for seeing, the moments when truth led to punishment, when clarity resulted in abandonment, and so each time you perceive what others deny, a somatic reaction may arise: tightness in the chest, a sinking feeling in the stomach, a sudden fatigue. These are not signs of weakness. They are the body's memory of danger. If you ignore them, if you force yourself to speak or to remain silent without reflection, you reenact an old trauma under the guise of insight. Thus, the work before you is not merely to see, but to contain what you see. Containment is an alchemical concept. It refers to the vessel in which transformation occurs. Without a vessel, the fire destroys rather than transforms. Your psyche must become such a vessel, capable of holding contradiction, ambiguity, and tension without collapsing into judgment or despair. This is not achieved by moral effort alone, but by a gradual dialogue with the unconscious. Through dreams, imagination, and honest self-examination, you may ask, at this point, whether it is worth it. Would it not be easier to close one's eyes, to live among the shared illusions, to accept the masks and be accepted in return? For some, perhaps, this is possible. But if you are listening to me now, if these words resonate in that peculiar way that bypasses the intellect and strikes directly at the soul, then I suspect you already know the answer. You cannot unsee what you have seen. The attempt to do so will only drive it deeper into the unconscious, where it will manifest as anxiety, depression, or a pervasive sense of meaninglessness. The danger, then, is not seeing what others do not. The danger is seeing without integrating, knowing without humility, perceiving without love. Love, in the Jungian sense, is not sentimentality. It is the capacity to grant reality to the other, including their blindness, without needing to destroy it. This does not mean you must lie, nor does it mean you must confront at every turn. It means you must learn the art of timing, of silence that is not repression, of speech that arises not from compulsion but from necessity. There is a moment, often quiet and easily missed, when the one who sees must decide whether to become a bridge or a weapon. This decision is rarely conscious, yet it shapes an entire life. To become a bridge is to accept loneliness without bitterness, to stand between worlds without belonging fully to either. and to trust that meaning emerges not from being understood, but from remaining faithful to the dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious. To become a weapon is to allow the shadow to take possession of the vision, turning insight into accusation and clarity into cruelty. I do not offer you comfort in the conventional sense. Depth psychology was never meant to soothe the ego. It was meant to awaken it to its true task. If you are one who sees what others do not, your task is not to wake the world, nor to retreat from it, but to undergo a transformation that renders your vision bearable, both to yourself and, perhaps one day, to others. This path is narrow, and it is fraught with misunderstanding, but it leads toward individuation, that lifelong process by which a human being becomes what he truly is, not in opposition to the world, but in conscious relation to it. And as this relation deepens, you may begin to sense that the very danger you feared was also the threshold to a more truthful, more integrated way of being, one that does not deny the shadow, but learns to walk with it, step by careful step, into the unknown that does not reveal itself all at once, but only to those who can tolerate its slow and often disquieting unfolding. You see, the psyche does not reward haste. It withholds its deeper truths from those who seek them as trophies, and it grants them only to those who are willing to be altered by what they discover. This is why the one who sees what others do not often feels that time itself behaves differently around them. While others rush toward conclusions, toward roles already defined, you linger in the in-between, in that suspended state where meaning has not yet crystallized. This waiting is not passive. It is an active endurance of uncertainty, and it exacts a cost. That cost is frequently paid in relationships. You may notice that bonds which once felt secure begin to loosen, not because of open conflict, but because of an unspoken divergence. Others sense that you are no longer fully participating in the shared fiction that sustains the group. You listen differently. You respond with pauses instead of reflexes. Your laughter comes a moment too late, or not at all. These subtle shifts are enough to awaken anxiety in those who rely on predictability for their psychic balance. They may attempt, unconsciously, to pull you back into alignment through humor, criticism, or moral appeal. Don't be so serious, they say, or why do you always read so much into things? What they are truly saying is, do not disturb the equilibrium that keeps my shadow hidden and willed. Here again the danger presents itself, for it is tempting to interpret such reactions as proof of your isolation, as evidence that you must walk this path alone. And indeed, there is a solitude inherent in individuation that cannot be bypassed. But solitude must not harden into contempt. The moment you secretly despise those who cannot see what you see, you have crossed a threshold into shadow possession. The psyche then splits the world into the enlightened and the blind, the awake and the asleep, and in doing so recreates the very dualism it claims to transcend. I must emphasize this with particular care. Insight without compassion becomes brutality. Compassion without insight becomes sentimentality. The task is to hold both, knowing that neither will ever be complete. This holding is not a technique, it is an inner attitude cultivated over years. often through failure. You will misjudge, you will speak too soon or remain silent too long, you will feel the sting of being misunderstood and, at times, the quieter pain of understanding too much. These experiences are not signs that you are on the wrong path, they are the path. In the unconscious, there exists an archetypal figure known across cultures, the seer, the prophet, the one-eyed God. This figure is revered and feared precisely because he embodies a contradiction. He sees beyond appearances, yet he is wounded by that very sight. Think of the myths in which knowledge is purchased at the cost of exile, blindness, or death. These are not moral fables meant to discourage knowledge. They are psychological truths about the price of consciousness. When awareness increases, innocence diminishes, and with the loss of innocence comes grief, a grief that must be mourned if the psyche is to remain whole. Many who see what others do not carry an unrecognized mourning within them. They mourn the simplicity they can no longer access, the ease of belonging that once came without effort. This grief often disguises itself as irritation, cynicism, or fatigue. But beneath these symptoms lies a deeper sorrow, the realization that reality is more complex, more ambivalent than the ego would like. If this grief is not acknowledged, it turns inward, poisoning the very insight that gave rise to it. Dreams, at this stage, often attempt to restore balance. You may dream of returning to a childhood home, only to find it altered or abandoned. You may dream of speaking a language no one understands, or of carrying an object of great importance that others treat as meaningless. These images are not to be interpreted literally. They are symbolic expressions of a psyche negotiating the tension between inner truth and outer recognition. The dream does not ask you to abandon one for the other. It asks you to find a form that can hold both. This brings us to a crucial and often misunderstood point. Not every truth you perceive is meant to be spoken. This is not because truth is dangerous in itself, but because the psyche unfolds according to its own rhythm. To force insight upon another is to violate that rhythm, just as surely as to suppress it within yourself. Wisdom lies not in constant revelation, but in discernment. Discernment, unlike judgment, arises from an attunement to the moment, to the readiness of both speaker and listener. You may resist this notion, feeling that silence is a form of complicity. But silence, when conscious, is not denial, it is incubation. In alchemical terms, it is the stage of nigredo, the darkening in which old forms dissolve and new ones are not yet visible. The one who sees must learn to endure this darkness without rushing to illuminate it prematurely. Otherwise, the light blinds rather than reveals. There is also a danger in over-identifying with suffering, in wearing one's isolation as a badge of authenticity. Suffering does not ennoble by itself. It only deepens the psyche if it is reflected upon, if meaning is wrested from it through engagement with the unconscious. Without this work, suffering merely accumulates, hardening into a private mythology of victimhood. The ego then says, "I suffer because I see," and in this statement hides its own shadow, the desire to be exceptional. To counter this, the psyche often introduces experiences of humility. You may find yourself mistaken in a perception you were certain of, or confronted with your own blind spot in a way that cannot be ignored. These moments are painful, but they are invaluable. They remind you that seeing is always partial, that the unconscious is vast, and that no single standpoint can encompass it. To accept this limitation is not to weaken your insight, but to ground it. Gradually, if the work is undertaken sincerely, something subtle begins to change. The urgency to be understood lessens. The compulsion to expose diminishes. You begin to recognize that the deepest validation comes not from others' agreement, but from an inner coherence, a feeling that your perceptions, emotions, and actions are aligned. This alignment does not make life easier in any superficial sense, but it renders it more real. At this point, others may begin to respond to you differently, though not always consciously. Some will still resist, for their shadow work is their own responsibility. But others may feel strangely at ease in your presence, even if they cannot articulate why. This is because you are no longer unconsciously demanding that they see what you see. You have become a container rather than a mirror, a presence that allows without forcing. This is perhaps the most paradoxical outcome of the path. When you relinquish the need to reveal, revelation sometimes occurs of its own accord. Do not misunderstand me. This does not mean you become passive or indifferent. On the contrary, your engagement with life may deepen, but it is no longer driven by the need to justify your perception or to defend your identity as one who sees. You act when action is required. You speak when speech serves transformation, and you remain silent when silence protects the delicate process unfolding in yourself or another. The danger of seeing what others do not never fully disappears. It is a lifelong companion, reappearing in new forms as consciousness expands. But it is no longer experienced as a threat alone. It becomes a signal, an indication that the psyche is once again approaching a threshold. And thresholds, as you know, are places of both risk and possibility. To stand at them requires courage, patience, and above all, a willingness to encounter your own shadow again and again, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a teacher whose lessons grow more subtle the longer you listen. In this way, the shadow reaction that once isolated you can become a guide, pointing not outward in accusation, but inward toward a deeper integration, where seeing is no longer a burden you carry alone, but a function of a psyche that has learned, however imperfectly, to hold the tension of opposites without tearing itself apart. And it is here, in this precarious balance, that the true work continues in a manner that is rarely dramatic on the surface, yet profoundly transformative within. At this stage, the psyche no longer announces its work through crisis alone, but through a quieter, more insistent questioning of one's own motives. You may find yourself asking, not for the first time, but with greater sincerity, why you need to see, what part of you is sustained by this perception, and what part is threatened by it. These questions do not arise from doubt in the destructive sense, but from a maturation of consciousness that senses the danger of fixation. For fixation is another shadow that stalks the one who sees. To be fixated on insight is to confuse a function of the psyche with the totality of the self. Vision, intuition, discernment, these are tools, not identities. When the ego confuses the tool for the whole, it becomes brittle, incapable of change. The psyche then compensates, often through experiences that force you into positions of unknowing. You may encounter situations in which your intuition fails, or where the complexity of reality exceeds your interpretive frameworks. Such moments can feel humiliating, even annihilating, but they serve a vital purpose. They return you to humility before the unconscious. It is here that many resist most strongly. The ego protests, insisting that without its special vision, it is nothing. But this fear reveals the deeper issue. The task is not to abandon sight, but to relinquish the narcissistic investment in being the one who sees. Only then can perception become fluid again, responsive rather than defensive. This is a subtle but decisive shift, and it often occurs not through insight alone, but through lived experience, through love, loss, failure, and the slow erosion of self-images that no longer serve. Love, in particular, plays a paradoxical role. To love another is to encounter the limits of one's perception. You may see their shadow clearly, perhaps too clearly, and yet find that this knowledge does not grant you power over the relationship. On the contrary, it exposes your own vulnerability. You discover that understanding does not eliminate pain, that awareness does not protect you from disappointment. This realization can be devastating to the ego, but it is indispensable to the psyche's development. It teaches you that seeing is not control, and that the mystery of the other cannot be reduced to psychological insight. In dreams, this stage often appears as an encounter with a figure who resists interpretation, a stranger whose face remains indistinct, a teacher who speaks in riddles, a child who asks a question you cannot answer. These figures represent aspects of the self that elude the ego's grasp. They remind you that the unconscious is not an object to be mastered, but a living reality with which you are in relationship. To relate is to listen, to respond, and at times to accept not knowing. There is also, at this point, a deepening awareness of the body. Earlier, I spoke of somatic reactions as memories of danger. Now they become something more, signals of alignment or misalignment between conscious attitude and unconscious truth. You may notice that when you act against your deeper knowing, perhaps to maintain harmony or to avoid conflict, the body reacts with tension, fatigue, or a dull ache. Conversely, when you act in accordance with an inner necessity, even if it brings difficulty, there is often a quiet sense of rightness, a groundedness that cannot be argued away. The body, in this sense, becomes an ally in the work of integration. This somatic intelligence is crucial, for it anchors insight in lived reality. Without it, perception floats, unmoored from experience, and becomes abstract. The danger of abstraction is that it allows the ego to speak about life without fully participating in it. But the psyche demands incarnation. It insists that what is known inwardly be tested outwardly, in relationships, in work, in ethical choices that carry real consequences. Only through this testing does insight acquire weight. As this embodiment deepens, the relationship to others shifts again. You may find that you are less reactive to their defenses, less inclined to interpret every resistance as a shadow reaction. You begin to recognize that their blindness serves a function, just as your sight serves one. This recognition does not excuse harm, nor does it require you to accept what violates your integrity, but it tempers judgment with understanding, and understanding with boundaries. Boundaries are essential here. Earlier, the one who sees often struggles with porous boundaries, absorbing others' unconscious material, feeling responsible for tensions that are not theirs. With integration, a firmer sense of self emerges, not rigid, but defined. You learn to distinguish between what you perceive and what you must carry. This distinction is subtle but life-changing. It allows you to remain present without being overwhelmed, to see without being consumed by what you see. At the same time, there may arise a longing for community, not based on shared illusion, but on shared depth. This longing is natural, and it is often met with disappointment, for such communities are rare and fragile, yet the longing itself is meaningful. It points toward an archetypal image of the temenos, the sacred space in which individuals can encounter one another without masks. Whether this space is found in analysis, in creative work, in a spiritual tradition, or in a single honest relationship, it provides a container in which the work can continue. One must be careful, however, not to idealize this space or those within it. Idealization is another form of blindness, a projection of the unintegrated self onto an external form. When the ideal inevitably fails, disillusionment follows, often more painful than the original isolation. The task is to remain in relationship without surrendering discernment, to belong without dissolving. As these movements unfold, the question of meaning becomes more central, not meaning as an abstract philosophy, but as a lived orientation that gives coherence to suffering and effort. You may sense that your capacity to see is not merely a personal trait, but a contribution, however modest, to the larger psyche of humanity. This sense does not inflate the ego if it is held rightly. It humbles it. For you realize that you are participating in a process far older and larger than yourself, one that unfolds through countless individual lives, each carrying a fragment of consciousness forward. This perspective brings with it a new kind of patience. You no longer demand immediate recognition or transformation, neither in yourself nor in others. You understand that psychological time is not linear, that insight ripens at its own pace. This does not lead to passivity, but to a steadier engagement, one that can endure setbacks without collapsing into despair or cynicism. Yet even here, the shadow does not disappear. It waits, often in the form of subtle pride or quiet resignation. You may catch yourself thinking that you have moved beyond the dangers of seeing, that you have achieved a kind of balance immune to disruption. Such thoughts are themselves signals, invitations to renewed vigilance. The psyche remains dynamic, and what is integrated at one level may reappear at another, asking to be met again. Thus, the work does not conclude, it deepens, The one who sees what others do not is continually asked to refine their relationship to vision itself, to remember that sight is always in service of something greater than the ego. When this remembrance fades, suffering returns, not as punishment, but as correction, and when it is renewed, there is a quiet sense of participation in a mystery that does not need to be solved, only lived attentively, imperfectly, and with a humility born not of self-denial, but of a long and honest conversation with the shadow that has, over time, become less an adversary and more a companion on the path that no longer promises certainty, but offers something rarer and more enduring, fidelity to the inner truth as it reveals itself moment by moment. At this final turn of our reflection, I must speak to you not as a teacher addressing a problem, but as a fellow traveler who knows that no resolution is ever absolute. The psyche does not conclude. It circles, deepens, revisits. What changes is not the presence of danger, but your capacity to meet it without fragmentation. By now, you may sense that the danger of seeing what others do not was never meant to be eliminated. It was meant to be metabolized. When insight first emerged, it struck like lightning, isolating and disruptive. Now it moves more like a subterranean current, shaping the landscape quietly. Invisibly, you still see, perhaps more clearly than before, but you are no longer compelled to react to every perception. This restraint is not suppression, it is sovereignty. Sovereignty of the psyche is not domination over others, nor even mastery over oneself. It is the capacity to remain present to inner reality without being driven by it. The images, intuitions, and perceptions that once overwhelmed you now approach as guests rather than invaders. You listen, you consider, and you respond in your own time. This inner freedom is the fruit of long engagement with the shadow, an engagement that has stripped away the illusion that consciousness must always be defended or asserted. At this stage, a profound reversal often occurs. Earlier, you felt endangered by others' blindness, by their refusal to see what you saw. Now you may recognize that their blindness once served as a necessary counterweight to your own intensity. It grounded you in the human world, forced you to negotiate, to translate, to remain related. Without it, you might have drifted too far into abstraction, into a solitary realm where insight loses contact with life. Thus, even resistance reveals its hidden meaning when viewed from a wider perspective. You may also notice a softening of your inner narrative. The story of being the one who sees no longer organizes your identity. Instead, identity itself becomes more fluid, less tied to any single function. You are no longer only the observer, the interpreter, the bearer of uncomfortable truths. You are also capable of forgetting, of resting in simple experience, of participating without analysis. This forgetting is not regression, it is integration. It signals that consciousness has loosened its grip, trusting the unconscious to carry what no longer needs to be held so tightly. In dreams, this shift may appear as images of return, coming home after a long journey, laying down a heavy object, entering a room where others are already gathered. These are not fantasies of escape, they are symbols of reconciliation, not with society as an abstraction, but with your own divided nature. The seer and the participant, the witness and the actor, begin to recognize one another as aspects of the same self. Yet even now, there will be moments when the old danger resurfaces. You will enter a situation and instantly perceive the unspoken tension, the hidden motive, the shadow at work. The familiar tightening may arise. The old question, should I speak? Should I withdraw? Should I intervene? What has changed is not the question, but the ground from which you ask it. You no longer ask from anxiety or compulsion, but from an inner stillness that can tolerate not having a perfect answer. Sometimes you will speak, not to expose, but to clarify. Sometimes you will remain silent, not from fear, but from respect for the process unfolding. And sometimes you will misjudge, as all human beings do, but even misjudgment is no longer catastrophic, for it does not threaten your core identity. It becomes part of the ongoing dialogue between consciousness and the unconscious, a dialogue that remains alive precisely because it is imperfect. There is, in this maturity, a new relationship to suffering. Earlier, suffering felt like the price of sight, a burden borne in isolation. Now it is recognized as an inevitable companion of depth, not because depth is pathological, but because it refuses simplification. You suffer not because you see, but because you are alive to the full ambiguity of existence. This suffering, when accepted, does not embitter, it deepens empathy, not as a moral posture, but as a lived resonance with the human condition. Empathy, however, no longer means absorption. You do not lose yourself in others' shadows, nor do you feel compelled to rescue them from their unconsciousness. You have learned, perhaps painfully, that no one can be saved from within by another. Each psyche must encounter its own darkness in its own time. Your role, if it can be called that, is simply to remain available, to stand as an example of someone who has not fled from that encounter. This availability is quiet. It does not announce itself. It is felt rather than proclaimed. Others may sense it without understanding it, just as they once sensed your unsettling presence, but now the reaction is different. Where there was defensiveness, there may be curiosity. Where there was hostility, there may be trust, not because you have changed them, but because you have ceased to unconsciously threaten them with your insight. And here we arrive at a truth that is difficult to accept, yet liberating once it is integrated. Seeing what others do not was never about them. It was about your own path toward wholeness. Others served as mirrors, antagonists, and companions along the way, but the work was always inward. The danger, the shadow reaction, the isolation, all were stages in a process aimed not at superiority, but at integration. Integration does not mean harmony in the sentimental sense. It means the capacity to hold contradictions without demanding their resolution. You can see and not see, know and not know, speak and remain silent, without splitting yourself apart. This inner flexibility is the mark of a psyche that has learned from its shadow rather than being ruled by it. If I leave you with anything, let it be this: Do not seek safety from your sight, and do not seek identity in it. Let it be what it is, a function of consciousness, alive, evolving, sometimes burdensome, sometimes illuminating. When you relate to it in this way, the danger does not vanish, but it is transformed. It becomes the edge at which growth occurs, the tension that keeps the psyche awake. And so you continue, not as one who stands apart from humanity, nor as one who dissolves into it, but as an individual in relation, aware of the darkness within and without, no longer compelled to deny it or to conquer it, but able, at last, to walk alongside it, attentive, grounded, and quietly committed to the unfolding of a life that does not require universal agreement to feel real, true, and inwardly whole.